December 8, 1941. Deep within the military headquarters of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat motionless at his desk. The noise of celebration echoed through the corridors around him. Staff officers pounded each other on the back, their voices rising in triumph over what they saw as a crushing blow delivered to the American fleet. Outside his window, he could observe the jubilation. Officers gestured animatedly, their faces flushed with what they believed was the certainty of victory. But Yamamoto, perhaps the single most informed Japanese leader regarding America's true manufacturing prowess, felt only a heavy sense of foreboding settle over him. Years in America had marked him differently than his peers. He had walked through the sprawling auto plants of Detroit, watching assembly lines move with mechanical precision. He had stood beneath the vast Texas sky, watching oil derricks stretch across the landscape in an endless procession. These experiences had shaped something in him, a clarity about industrial realities that few of his colleagues possessed. The prophecy he had spoken months before now haunted him with uncanny accuracy. He had warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye, "I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months. But I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." From a tactical standpoint, the morning's assault had been executed flawlessly. 8 battleships now lay crippled or sunken on the harbor bottom. Nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed before they could even take flight. Yet Yamamoto understood what his superiors did not. The American aircraft carriers had slipped away untouched, and more critically, a previously fractured American nation had just become unified in its determination. The Japanese High Command had guaranteed that every American would fight with total commitment. The mathematics of conflict were already decided, though no one around him grasped this truth. Yamamoto could see it clearly. What his fellow commanders refused to comprehend was that they had ignited something far larger than themselves. The industrial machinery of America, dormant but intact, would soon awaken with terrifying potential. A productive capacity so immense that even Japan's most pessimistic intelligence estimates would prove hopelessly optimistic. Every strategic assumption the Japanese leadership had built would crumble before that onslaught. Ambition and miscalculation had constructed a bridge to ruin. Throughout the 1930s, Japan had pursued a course of territorial conquest. The takeover of Manchuria in 1931, the massive military campaign against China starting in 1937, the seizure of French Indochina in 1940. Each action reflected a single driving impulse, the creation of a unified empire that could sustain itself without external dependency. Japanese war planners had studied the numbers carefully, and those numbers painted a troubling picture. In 1937, Japan's manufacturing output represented merely 5.2% of global industrial production. This placed them roughly on par with France, and substantially behind both Great Britain and the Soviet Union. America, meanwhile, controlled nearly 42% of all world manufacturing. Even when considering the severity of the American economic depression, the United States maintained a war-making capacity that dwarfed Japan's by a factor of 7 to 10 times. These figures circulated through Japanese planning rooms. Officers discussed them in hushed tones. Military strategists knew them by heart. Yet they gambled regardless, betting everything on a single, elegant but desperate assumption. Their strategy required that they could capitalize on their initial Pearl Harbor advantage through a series of rapid successive victories. They would seize the petroleum-rich territories and resource areas throughout Southeast Asia in lightning campaigns. These swift conquests would establish a defensive barrier so extensive and so heavily fortified that Americans would recoil from the cost of attempting to breach it. Confronted with the prospect of a grinding conflict stretching across the vast Pacific, American leadership would choose negotiation over endless bloodshed. Japan's conquests would be recognized. Peace would come. Everything depended upon this single miscalculation about American national character and resolve. This fundamental misreading of their enemy would become the Pacific War's greatest strategic catastrophe. The Japanese High Command had gravely misjudged what they faced. They failed to understand American determination, America's actual productive capacity, and the resilience of the American people. Admiral Yamamoto stood apart from this thinking. His understanding rested on first-hand experience. Before the war, he had lived in America on two separate occasions. First, as a student attending Harvard from 1919 through 1921, drinking in the culture and capabilities of the nation. Then again, serving as a naval attaché posted in Washington from 1926 through 1928, observing American military development firsthand. His travels had carried him across the American continent. He had witnessed the assembly line miracle that was Detroit's automobile production. Vehicles rolling out at rates that Japanese manufacturing could only dream of matching. He had observed Texas petroleum infrastructure, vast and productive beyond anything Japan possessed. He had seen the casual prosperity of ordinary American civilians, the breathtaking scale of agricultural output, the continental reach of American railroads and highways and ports. This knowledge made him a voice of opposition to war with America before 1941, grounded in the bedrock of reality rather than wishful thinking. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas, he had written, knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. His resistance to the war had made him a target for militant faction within the military structure, extremists who saw his views as defeatist. Pressure had mounted until his transfer to command of the combined fleet offered a kind of protective exile from assassination attempts. Now assigned to plan the very conflict he had warned against, Yamamoto constructed the Pearl Harbor operation as the one possible path to the quick victory Japan required. But strategy cannot be built on hope alone, and Yamamoto's private certainty never translated into decisive action that might have prevented the catastrophe. The initial months of fighting seemed to vindicate Japanese assumptions. Japanese victories accumulated with stunning speed and scope. Days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck across the Pacific and throughout Southeast Asia, overwhelming American and British and Dutch positions. The Philippines fell. Guam surrendered. Wake Island was seized. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, each fell in rapid succession to Japanese military power. By March of 1942, Japan's sphere of control stretched from deep within China to the Central Pacific, from island chains in the north to the approaches of Australia itself. The defensive perimeter, as planned, was established. Resources flowed toward Japan. Petroleum, rubber, tin, rice, all the commodities Japan required arrived from conquered territories. The campaign appeared to be unfolding according to the strategic blueprint. These early triumphs bred dangerous overconfidence among Japanese commanders. The rapid collapse of Allied resistance, the apparent weakness of opponent forces, and what seemed to be validation of their strategic vision, convinced many officers that American industrial capacity had been greatly exaggerated in pre-war estimates. Planners at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo began conceptualizing even more aggressive operations. They became convinced that America simply lacked the determination to mount a serious counteroffensive. Yet warning indicators appeared throughout this period of apparent triumph, visible to anyone willing to acknowledge them. The Doolittle raid struck on April 18, 1942, tactically negligible but psychologically significant. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet positioned 650 miles from Japan, reached Japanese airspace and struck at Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. The physical destruction proved minimal, barely noticeable in the grand scheme. But something far more important had occurred. Japanese soil, considered sacred and inviolable, had been bombed by American aircraft. The homeland itself had been violated. This incursion exposed Japan's strategic vulnerability and prompted a fateful decision: the order to extend the defensive perimeter even further eastward. This expansion would ultimately lead to the Battle of Midway. Before that, the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided another signal that things were changing. Though neither side achieved decisive tactical advantage, with both losing aircraft carriers, the strategic mathematics favored America. Japan's planned invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled. For the first time since December, Japanese expansion had encountered resistance. American forces, despite being outnumbered in some respects, had fought the Imperial Japanese Navy to a stalemate. Then June arrived. The 4th through the 7th of 1942, Midway. The confrontation that would shatter Japanese naval supremacy and expose the hollowness of their strategic calculations. Yamamoto had orchestrated the Midway operation, intending to draw the remaining American carriers into a final decisive engagement. Japanese intelligence assessments held that the Yorktown, damaged during the Coral Sea fighting, remained out of service. American carrier strength in the Pacific, they believed, stood at 2 vessels. The reality differed dramatically. American dockyard workers at Pearl Harbor had accomplished near miraculous feats of repair, restoring Yorktown to operational status in 72 hours of continuous work. 3 American carriers would confront 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. More consequentially, American intelligence personnel had partially deciphered Japanese naval codes. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, under Commander Joseph Rochefort's direction, had cracked enough of the JN-25 code to identify that AF, Japan's operational target designation, referred to Midway. To confirm this deduction, American commanders had Midway broadcast a message in unencrypted form mentioning water purification problems. Within hours, Japanese radio traffic referenced that AF faced freshwater shortages. The trap had been set with precision. The engagement itself proceeded with terrifying swiftness. On June 4th's dawn, Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched aircraft against Midway Island. While these strike aircraft remained airborne, American torpedo bombers departed USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, attacking the Japanese fleet formation. The torpedo assault ended in slaughter, 41 of 41 torpedo bombers shot down. Yet this sacrifice accomplished something vital. Japanese fighters descended to low altitude to intercept the torpedo bombers, leaving the upper sky undefended. American dive bombers arrived in this opening. Approximately 10:22 in the morning, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown descended simultaneously on the Japanese carrier formation. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, lay mortally wounded, their decks crowded with fuel and ordnance that ignited in catastrophic fires. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, survived the initial assault and launched strikes that severely damaged Yorktown. But by evening, American dive bombers found Hiryu as well, administering fatal wounds. By June 7th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had sunk along with 1 cruiser. Japan lost 3,100 men, 248 aircraft, and most critically, approximately 100 trained pilots, plus numerous irreplaceable aviation technicians and maintenance specialists. American losses measured lighter: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The immediate tactical consequence proved obvious. Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The deeper significance took longer to surface. Midway had stripped away the veneer, exposing fundamental deficiencies in Japanese preparation, training systems, and industrial foundation that would ultimately prove fatal. Japan began the conflict with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones. America started with 3 fleet carriers in the Pacific. The truly critical question, however, concerned replacement rates. How rapidly could each nation rebuild carrier losses? The answer would devastate every Japanese strategic estimate. American industrial mobilization in World War II represented perhaps the greatest sustained economic effort humanity has ever witnessed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressing Congress less than a month following Pearl Harbor, announced production targets that astounded even his own advisors. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, escalating to 125,000 in 1943. 120,000 tanks across the same period. 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. America would not merely meet these targets, it would exceed them substantially. The scale defied comprehension. In the 3 years following Midway, Japanese shipyards built 6 aircraft carriers. American shipyards, in that identical time frame, delivered 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and numerous escort carriers. The Essex-class carriers alone represented an industrial accomplishment that Japanese planners struggled to fathom. The United States Navy initially ordered 32 of these vessels. Though not all reached completion before war's end, 24 were built and 14 saw combat service. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 30,000 tons, stretched 870 feet in length, and carried more than 90 aircraft. At maximum production rates, American yards launched one Essex-class carrier approximately every 6 weeks. During 1944 alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan, constructed during the entire conflict period, from 1939 through 1945. America produced roughly 297,000 aircraft total. Japan managed approximately 76,000. American shipyards delivered more tonnage during the first 4.5 months of 1943 than Japan launched in 7 years combined. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run facility outside Detroit produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production levels. This multiplication of capacity extended across every weapons category. American factories constructed 86,000 tanks against Japan's approximately 2,000 medium and heavy tanks. America manufactured 2 million trucks. Japan achieved approximately 165,000. Artillery pieces, rifles, machine guns, ammunition. Across every category of military equipment, American production exceeded Japanese output by margins ranging from 5 times to 20 times over. Japanese military planners possessed access to substantial portions of this information. Intelligence reports reached Tokyo. Observations from neutral countries provided data points. Captured equipment and battlefield encounters revealed American capabilities. Yet the numbers created a psychological barrier that prevented rational strategic response. The figures proved so overwhelming that genuinely accepting them required accepting the inevitability of defeat. Japanese commanders instead chose a different path. They held to the belief that figures might be inflated. That Japanese quality and fighting spirit would somehow overcome quantitative disadvantage. That tactical brilliance and sacrifice might yet turn the tide. Yamamoto harbored no such illusions. His understanding of American power only deepened as combat years accumulated. Historians remain uncertain whether Yamamoto actually spoke the celebrated words later attributed to him. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." This quotation first appeared in the 1970 film Tora, 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 with no documentary evidence supporting its original attribution. Whether Yamamoto pronounced these exact words remains unknowable. His actual recorded views, however, conveyed precisely this sentiment. What Yamamoto definitively wrote in a January 9, 1942 letter was this: "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame simply for the one smitten." He grasped a fundamental truth: defeating an unprepared opponent reveals nothing about comparative power. The true examination would arrive when America mobilized its full industrial potential. That mobilization gathered force through 1942 and reached complete momentum by 1943. Industrial statistics translated into combat reality across Pacific battlefields. Guadalcanal witnessed fierce combat from August 1942 through February 1943. American forces demonstrated an ability to sustain operations across oceanic vastness. The campaign evolved into grinding, relentless struggle that exposed critical Japanese vulnerabilities. Logistics, supply chains, personnel replacement, industrial replacement capacity. Japan had prepared for quick, decisive engagements, not prolonged operations consuming resources continuously. The Japanese merchant fleet, essential for supplying distant territories, withered steadily beneath American submarine assault. Japanese shipbuilding never compensated for mounting losses. During 1943, American submarines destroyed more Japanese tonnage than Japanese shipyards produced. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine faced terminal collapse, incapable of provisioning occupied territories or transporting resources homeward. Petroleum from the Dutch East Indies, the very resource Japan had entered the war to secure, increasingly remained in foreign harbors as tankers succumbed to American torpedoes. Japanese aircraft production followed similar trajectories. While American factories produced newer, superior fighter designs in ever-increasing quantities, Japanese production numbers stagnated and technology advancement stalled. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter, remarkably capable when introduced in 1940, continued serving as the frontline fighter throughout the entire war with only superficial modifications. American fighters evolved dramatically, from the adequate F-4F Wildcat to the superior F-6F Hellcat, to the exceptional F-4U Corsair, with each generation outperforming its predecessor substantially. By 1943, American aircraft possessed demonstrable superiority over Japanese designs, and they appeared in overwhelming numbers that saturated Japanese air defense. Pilot training disparity magnified these advantages significantly. America's expansive educational system could sustain massive pilot training infrastructure. Aviation cadets received comprehensive instruction in multi-engine aircraft operations, navigation techniques, tactical formations, and gunnery. Training completion rates remained consistently high, and the stream of replacement pilots expanded throughout the war years. Japan's pilot programs, hamstrung by resource shortage and casualty replacement demands, compressed training schedules and lowered qualification standards. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with only a fraction of the flying hours their American counterparts accumulated. American aircraft piloted by superior, well-trained aviators delivered exactly what military logic predicted. The losses mounted ruthlessly among Japanese flight crews, reaching levels that could not be sustained. Yet despite mounting evidence of American industrial dominance flooding in from every theater, many within Japan's military establishment held fast to a different vision. They believed in Yamato Dama-shay, the spiritual essence of old Japan, and in the conviction that superior morale and unbreakable fighting spirit could somehow overcome material scarcity. Bushido culture ran deep through the officer corps. Honor meant everything. Sacrifice was virtue. Surrender was unthinkable. These values produced extraordinary acts of individual courage and commitment. Yet they also blinded strategic thinkers to hard realities that demanded honest reassessment of the war's direction. By the summer of 1944, the Mariana Islands became the point where Japan's leadership could no longer hide from the truth. On June 15th, American forces stormed ashore on Saipan. They brought massive naval firepower, endless supplies, and overwhelming numbers. Japanese defenders, despite fighting with desperate valor, were pushed back relentlessly. The battle raged through the heat of the Pacific summer, and when it ended on July 9th, Saipan belonged to America. The tempo of American conquest accelerated. Tinian fell on August 1st. Guam was secured by August 10th. The strategic situation had transformed completely. With the Marianas secured, American B-29 Super Fortress bombers suddenly sat within striking distance of Japan's home islands themselves. The defensive perimeter that Japan had so carefully constructed lay broken. The homeland now faced direct bombardment from the air. Japan could no longer stop the American advance. The crushing weight of American naval power, air superiority, endless supplies, and constantly arriving trained personnel meant American forces could strike virtually anywhere they chose and overwhelm whatever stood in their way through sheer material advantage. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, the very man who had driven Japan into this war, took the blame for the Mariana catastrophe. He lost his political support and was forced to resign on July 18, 1944. General Kuniaki Koso stepped into his place, inheriting an impossible task. Defeat was now effectively certain, yet surrender remained politically unacceptable and militarily incomprehensible to the warrior culture that dominated Japan's government. The nation would continue fighting, desperately hoping for the miracle that would never materialize. Just as the Mariana Islands campaign was unfolding, the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted on June 19th and 20th. It provided one more brutal demonstration of American material supremacy. Japanese naval aviators launched desperate attacks against American carriers, and American pilots responded by slaughtering them in what became known as the Great Mariana Turkey Shoot. Across those 2 days of aerial combat, Japan hemorrhaged approximately 480 aircraft and 3 carriers went down, including the newest carrier Taiho. American losses remained comparatively light. Japanese naval aviation, already weakened by years of grinding attrition, never recovered its striking power. American commanders now possessed absolute certainty about their advantages. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, leading Southwest Pacific operations, directed their forces with the confidence that came from material abundance beyond measure. When American commanders planned operations, they calculated supplies lavishly, ammunition generously, and continuous reinforcement as standard assumptions. Japanese defenders fought under entirely different conditions. Supplies dwindled steadily, ammunition ran perpetually short. Relief never came. The disparity shaped everything. The Philippines campaign, which stretched from October 1944 through July 1945, exposed this inequality starkly. American forces landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944, supported by the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific War to that point. Desperate Japanese command committed virtually their entire remaining fleet to defending the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf from October 23 through 26, 1944. The result became the largest naval battle in history, and Japan suffered complete defeat. 4 separate engagements composed the battle. In one, American carrier aircraft attacked the massive battleship Musashi and sent it to the bottom. In Surigao Strait, American battleships and destroyers annihilated a Japanese southern force. Off Samar, a Japanese center force encountered American escort carriers in confused action, where Japanese command failures prevented what could have been complete American disaster. Finally, off Cape Engano, American carriers destroyed the remnants of Japanese carrier aviation. By October 26, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and thousands of trained sailors. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again operate in fleet strength. The strategic bombing of Japan intensified throughout 1944 and 1945, bringing the war's industrial reality directly to civilian and military leaders alike. B-29 superfortresses, launched from the Marianas, struck Japanese cities with ever-increasing frequency and destructive power. The bombing campaign evolved gradually from precision attacks on specific industrial targets into area bombing designed to destroy entire urban manufacturing centers. Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9 and 10, 1945, represented the destructive climax of the campaign. 334 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 1,965 tons of incendiary ordnance across Tokyo's densely packed residential and industrial sections. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left more than 1 million homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in all human history, deadlier than either atomic bomb that would follow months later. 66 other Japanese cities endured similar incendiary attacks. By war's end, between 350,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians had perished in the strategic bombing campaign. Major industrial cities lay reduced to ash and rubble, yet even this apocalyptic destruction failed to break the Japanese will to resist. The military government, dominated by army officers committed to fighting until national extinction, refused any consideration of surrender. Emperor Hirohito, traditionally positioned above political and military affairs, grew increasingly alarmed as the true situation became undeniable. The emperor received regular briefings on the war's progress. By early 1945, he understood clearly that Japan faced defeat. Yet his constitutional position and the army's political power prevented him from directly commanding surrender. Japan's government remained paralyzed between certainty of defeat and cultural inability to accept it. The Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8, 1945, destroyed Japan's final diplomatic hopes. Japanese leaders had attempted to leverage Soviet neutrality to negotiate some settlement. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 had allowed both nations to direct their forces elsewhere. Japanese diplomats had hoped Stalin might serve as mediator between Japan and the Western Allies, perhaps securing surrender terms short of unconditional capitulation. This hope was pure delusion. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had committed to entering the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Exactly 90 days later, August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria with crushing strength, annihilating Japanese armies that had been stripped of resources defending the home islands. In a single week, Soviet forces overran Japanese positions that had taken years to construct. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most powerful formation, disintegrated under the Soviet assault. The Soviet invasion meant Japan now faced enemies everywhere, with no diplomatic escape remaining. Yet even this catastrophe did not produce immediate surrender. Japanese government leaders, particularly army hardliners, proposed continuing the war through national sacrifice, inflicting such casualties on American invasion forces that favorable peace terms might somehow still be salvaged. This fantasy persisted even after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9. The bombs killed approximately 130,000 people in the immediate blasts, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation sickness in the following weeks. Yet army hardliners within Japan's military government still argued that surrender remained dishonorable. Only Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention, breaking constitutional precedent, forced Japan's acceptance of defeat. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese people, announcing surrender. It was the first time most Japanese had ever heard their emperor speak. His language carefully avoided the word surrender. Instead, he announced that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The announcement stunned a population that had been repeatedly assured Japan was winning. The sudden acknowledgement of defeat shattered the propaganda that had sustained popular morale. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, overseeing Japan's occupation and reconstruction. The occupation exposed Japanese people directly to American material abundance and organizational efficiency on a scale they had never imagined. American soldiers arrived with equipment, supplies, and resources that Japanese civilians had never conceived existed. For former Japanese military leaders, post-war interrogation and war crimes trials forced painful confrontation with their failures. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, on trial for war crimes, was forced to admit that Japan had fundamentally underestimated American industrial potential. "We did not adequately understand the American potential," he testified. This represented a stunning admission from the man who had guided Japan into war. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military officers revealed systematic failures in comprehending American military capabilities beyond simple production statistics. Japanese planners had failed to grasp American logistics and supply abilities, the capacity to project military power across vast oceans while sustaining adequate supplies. They had underestimated American technological innovation and adaptability. Most critically, they had failed to recognize that American military doctrine emphasized material advantage rather than warrior spirit. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier-striking force at Pearl Harbor and Midway, died by suicide during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944. But his surviving staff officers testified about Japanese planning assumptions and calculations. They acknowledged that Japanese intelligence had actually provided accurate information about American industrial production. The failure was not in gathering intelligence, but in strategic interpretation. Japanese commanders had known the numbers, but refused to accept what they meant. Post-war analysis by both Japanese and American historians identified the core of Japan's strategic miscalculation. Japan had gambled on a short war because Japanese leaders understood they could never win a prolonged one. But the gamble rested on assumptions about American psychology that proved completely false. Japanese planners believed Americans were soft, decadent, divided, and unwilling to endure hardship. They believed Pearl Harbor would shock American society into accepting Japanese hegemony across Asia. Instead, Pearl Harbor unified American society completely behind total war. The attack transformed American industrial potential into actual military production. Roosevelt's production goals, which seemed fantastic in December 1941, were met and surpassed because American industry, labor, and agriculture mobilized completely. Women poured into factories in unprecedented numbers. Agricultural productivity soared through mechanization. Raw material extraction expanded dramatically. The American economy expanded at 15% annually throughout the war years, while simultaneously producing military equipment, maintaining civilian consumption, and providing massive aid to allied nations. Japan faced a starkly different situation. Japan's economy, smaller from the beginning, faced crippling constraints. American submarine warfare devastated Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off resources from conquered territories. Strategic bombing destroyed urban manufacturing centers. Naval blockade cut off raw material supplies. Japanese industrial output contracted through material scarcity. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had declined to approximately 150 aircraft monthly. American production exceeded 8,000 monthly. Japanese soldiers went hungry for ammunition, while American forces had ammunition for waste. Japanese civilians starved while American servicemen ate abundantly. Several former Japanese officers in memoirs and interviews, decades after the war, offered frank assessments of their strategic errors. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs that Japan had fought a war it was destined to lose from the very beginning. We understood American material superiority intellectually, but we did not grasp its implications emotionally. We believed spirit could overcome matter. This was our fundamental error. Mitsumasa Yonai, who served as Prime Minister and Navy Minister at various times during the war, told interrogators in 1945 that Japanese naval officers had warned civilian leaders that war with America was unwinnable. These warnings were ignored by army leaders who controlled government policy. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving fighter pilot with 64 confirmed victories, wrote extensively after the war about the declining quality of Japanese pilots and aircraft as the conflict progressed. In his autobiography Samurai, published in 1957, Sakai described watching newly trained pilots deployed to combat with minimal flight training. They were slaughtered. They never had a chance. By 1944, we veteran pilots understood we were losing. We could see American aircraft quality improving while our development stagnated. We could see American plane numbers increasing while ours declined. But we kept fighting because we had no alternative. The industrial statistics that documented Japan's defeat were compiled after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The final accounting proved starkly revealing. America produced approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. American factories built more than 5,000 ships. American shipyards replaced every Allied ship sunk by Axis forces and then built additional capacity beyond pre-war tonnage. Japanese production, by comparison, proved utterly inadequate. Japan built 6 carriers after Midway. America built 122 carriers of all types. Japan produced 76,000 aircraft total. America produced nearly 300,000. Japan built approximately 165,000 trucks. America built 2 million. In steel production, oil refining, aluminum fabrication, electronics, and every single category of industrial output, American production exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 10 to 20. The human cost of Japan's miscalculation was devastating. Approximately 2,800,000 Japanese military personnel died in the war. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians died from bombing, starvation, and war-related causes. These casualties occurred in a war that Japanese leaders had started while understanding it was unwinnable. For Japan's high command, the moment of true realization arrived at different times for different individuals. Some, like Yamamoto, understood from the beginning. Others clung to delusions until Saipan fell, or Leyte Gulf, or the atomic bombings. But eventually all confronted the same inescapable reality. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s, the lessons of 1941 to 1945 shaped Japanese thinking about power, prosperity, and international relations. Modern Japan achieved far greater success through trade and industry than it ever gained through military conquest. The industrial capacity that Japanese leaders in the 1930s had sought to seize by force was ultimately developed through peaceful enterprise and competition. The story of Japan's high command, finally recognizing America's true power, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of strategic self-deception. Information was available, warnings were offered, evidence accumulated steadily. Yet institutional momentum, cultural biases, and political constraints prevented rational strategic reassessment until defeat became absolutely undeniable. For individual Japanese officers, realization came through varied experiences at different moments. Some witnessed it in the endless avalanche of American aircraft. Others saw it in the boundless supplies supporting American advances. Some understood when their own forces went hungry while American prisoners ate well. Others grasped it only when B-29s transformed their cities into ash. America's industrial capacity was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was concrete material reality that determined the war's outcome as certainly as if the final battles had already been decided in December 1941. The Japanese High Command had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant possessed productive power beyond Japanese capacity to resist. The mathematical certainty of defeat had been written in production statistics before Pearl Harbor even occurred. Japanese planners had access to those numbers. They simply chose not to believe them until the evidence became absolutely undeniable. In that choice lay the destruction of Imperial Japan and the deaths of millions. The price of strategic delusion was paid in full by August 1945, serving as history's most expensive lesson in the relationship between industrial power and military outcome.